Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We are continuing our marathon of racking and stacking interesting conversations before I disappear. And it occurred to me, I mentioned in the solo podcast on Friday that I had done this panel at AAI about Paul Cantor. I was on the pop culture panel. There was also one on Shakespeare, which I'm unqualified to participate in. Though I do love annoying Shakespeare scholars by just asking them, did he really exist? Did he really write all those things, just to annoy them? One of my co-panelists was actually a colleague of mine at AAI. He went from being a suit to being a scholar at AAI. He is also a devotee of all things pop culture, and more like Paul Cantor in the sense that he actually has like a fancy PhD in like literature or something, or English and all that kind of thing. And I said, why haven't I had him on the podcast? So I invited him on the podcast. So Chris Scalia, welcome to the Remnant.
Thank you, Jonah. It's great to be with you. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
So we're going to get to the pop culture stuff, but I figured I needed to front load something, because sometimes listeners don't like the pop culture stuff. They're like, save that for Glop. And in the great spirit of Dr. Johnny Fever from WKRP, I talk about whatever the hell I want on this podcast. And so I could just yell booger for the next hour. But I did think that some adroit listeners might have been curious about the fact that your last name is Scalia, and that you might be related to another almost as famous Scalia, Antonin Scalia, the late great Supreme Court Justice. And that is in fact the case, correct?
That is correct. I am the eighth of his 9 children. Number 8 in the birth order, number 1 in their hearts, as I like to say.
Nice. I until the Scalia I saw the most was the priest.
Yes.
Which is Paul, right?
Yes, Father Paul Scalia of the Arlington Diocese. Was
he like, just going by gross pop culture stereotypes, like Saturday Night Fever and whatnot, was he your mom's favorite just because he was the priest, and that's just like the dream of good Catholic families, is to have a priest kid?
Well, I think he's the favorite now, but growing up, I don't know that there were many indications that he was any better behaved than those of us who didn't go on to become a priest. So I have great memories of him shooting bottle rockets from our house and things like that. So I don't know how evident it was early on to my parents that he would go that direction. But I did get a lot of my pop culture tastes from him, especially my musical tastes. So. And of course, he's been a significant influence religiously too. But first, it was the pop cultural influence.
So just on that note, and again, I'm asking this all in the spirit of respect and whatnot. But does he have strong feelings about Father Guido Sarducci?
We have never talked about Father Guido Sarducci. We talk about the Godfather a lot, but it is weird. You would think we would talk about Guido Sarducci more, but he's just not. He was never a big factor in the Scalia family conversations. The Sopranos a little bit more, but specific fictional priests. We had so many real life priests to talk about and occasionally make fun of.
All right, so I warned you in advance because I wanted permission. I wasn't going to bring up your dad if you didn't want to talk about your dad. Just like seems like good manners, not to surprise somebody, but that kind of thing. But I heard an interview once, which I thought was it Joan Biskupic who wrote a biography of your dad? And I never read it. I don't know if it's any good on all the legal stuff and all that. But I remember listening to her on C-SPAN being interviewed over it, and I thought it was just sort of fascinating. And the way I remember it, and you correct me if I've got this wrong, is that your grandfather and grandmother were both from big families, right? Lots of siblings, and they all came to the States, got very highly educated, and then none of them had kids except for your dad. So is that right? Is that he's the only one of his generation in the Scalia family?
Yeah, that's pretty close to right. His father only had a sister, and he came to the United States from Sicily when he was in his late teens, and she came a little bit later. And his sister didn't have any children. His mother was her parents were immigrants. She had, I think, 6 siblings, 6 or 7, and none of them had children except for his mother. So yeah, he was the king.
Right. So
he was the only one, and then he went on, obviously, to have 9 children of his own.
Right. So the Skupic's point about this putting your dad on the couch a little bit was that he grew up in this environment with all of these aunts and uncles around, plus his own parents, and it was a fairly intellectual or literate, artistically oriented family, and he had to sort of serve as the performer for all of them. And her theory was that this is one of the things that made your dad sort of like a performative guy. I mean, like certainly in his writing, but also just in his presence, he was, and I say this with the utmost respect. I love the guy, from afar, but he had a flair for the dramatic, right? He was kind of like an intellectually operatic kind of guy. And this was her theory about where that came from. Does that make any sense to you?
It does make sense. You did ask me about the education of his family, and I didn't answer that. Yeah, his father was a professor of Romance languages, and his mother was a school teacher. So yeah, he came from pretty well-educated parentage. And I think Biskupic's assumptions they make sense, though. It's not like he was the only member of his family who was like that. It was just kind of a dramatic family to begin with. They all liked to talk. The ones I got to know pretty well liked telling stories, and they were good at it. But yeah, my dad was definitely a ham, and he liked. Or in high school, he starred in the school productions at Georgetown. He was part of the school's theater club there. Other members at different times obviously included Bradley Cooper and Jefferson Davis. So kind of mixed lineage there. But yeah, he definitely liked to perform. And I think that absolutely kind of part of that came from the fact that he was the center of attention for so many people in his family. And I would say that also, being the only child of that generation inspired him to have a large family. My great aunt used to tell us a story about how she remembered my father when he was a kid going into the backyard of where he spent some time in New Jersey, and he used to he was just on his own and lonely and muttering under his breath that he was going to have a lot of kids because he didn't want any of them to be lonely and bored like he was. So he was true to his word.
Okay, so we're not going to get deep into the legal stuff and all of that, but I did want to ask one other thing. When I started at AEI, Judge Bork was still there, and I hung out in Bork's orbit quite a bit. Walter Burns was still there, and there were a lot of legendary conversations about an old poker game.
Yeah,
that Scalia, Rehnquist, Bork, Burns. I can't remember who else.
Irving Kristol.
That's right. Who was also still there when I got to AEI. How often were those games played, and were they ever at your house?
They rotated. I think the games were once a month, and the houses rotated. So occasionally they would be at my house, and we were never allowed to participate. Obviously, none of the kids and my mother, none of us were allowed to participate. Basically, the kitchen was off limits whenever those those matches were going on. And, I was pretty clueless about, I didn't know who any of the people were when the poker game started. In retrospect, I should have hidden a corner and taken notes. It's such a ridiculous lineup of players there. But
I mean, in my little egghead world, that is like second only to getting a picture of dogs actually playing poker.
No, you're right. Yeah, that cheesy Republican painter who does all those portraits of great Republicans should do the version of that. I really, that's a great idea. There's another. When my father was confirmed, there was a big party for him. His friends threw, and they had this blow up. A cork board blow up of a political cartoon that had him and Rehnquist. It was kind of a spoof of the American Gothic painting with him and Rehnquist and President Nixon. And a bunch of his friends signed it. And the people who signed this thing, I'd always liked the cartoon. I thought it was pretty funny. And it was in our basement near our TV for all of my childhood, so I knew it well, but I never really paid attention to the names. But whenever I look at it now, I see the names, and it's like Ken Starr, Larry Silberman, Walter Burns, Ruth Ginsburg, Robert Bork. It's just a murderer's row of legal figures from the 1980s and 90s. And again, I was a kid. I didn't get it. I didn't realize. Obviously, I knew it was a big deal that my dad had been confirmed to the Supreme Court, and I understood that it was a big job when he was on the court. But a lot of it was lost on me at the time.
So, and again, you can dodge this entirely if you like. But was your dad unduly vexed by the borking of Bork?
I don't remember it at the time, but in retrospect, conversations with him about it, yeah, absolutely, he thought it was it was unfair. There are arguments that Judge Bork could have handled the hearings better with some of his answers. He came across as a little arrogant and things like that, but it was especially. It didn't come. It was a year after my father had been confirmed 98-0. And not that they were the same figures and had the same history, but it was just and obviously Democrats then with Bork had control of the Senate. It was just such a sudden turnaround. It was vexing. But yeah, I don't have details of, specific things he said about it at the time.
It wasn't like your mother shooed all the kids away from dad for a little while.
No, we had front row seats when he was muttering over the morning newspaper at the breakfast table.
Yeah, I mean, the Bork hearing, I mean, we don't need to get deep in the weeds on it, but like, if you go back and you watch it, it was, I guess, my senior year of high school, something like that. It was 87, right?
Yeah, 87.
And, the remarkable thing about it is like that was the moment, like if you ever watch Supreme Court nomination hearings now and they don't answer any questions and they say, I can't answer a hypothetical or I can't talk about something that I might have to rule on. It's all because of the Bork thing, right? Because Bork actually ran it like a Yale seminar where he's like, well, that's an interesting question. You could do this, or you could do that.
Right, exactly.
And that's one of the things that killed him. I mean, other than, the perfidy of Joe Biden and Ted Kennedy. But.
Well, the answer of his that gets the most criticism is somebody asked him why he wanted to be on the Supreme Court. And he said one of the reasons was that it would be an intellectual feast, which is certainly true. And that's a very professorial answer. But I think that was kind of turned against him as suggesting he was just, in it, as they say on reality shows, he was in it for the wrong reasons. But yeah, it was just obviously those hearings changed everything. And it led to, the next guy also, his replacement was a replacement nominee. Was
it Ginsburg?
Yeah, he also had to bow out because of
the demon weed.
Yeah, exactly. Which is hard to imagine somebody bowing out for now.
I always thought, again, you'd hear these stories because Scalia, your dad, and Bork they were both at AEI together for a while. When
Yeah.
your dad was the editor of, I believe, Regulation magazine.
Yeah.
And
renew your subscription.
The thing is like, I loved Judge Bork. I mean, a very intimidating dude, but like, I got to be pretty friendly with him. But the thing is, and I think I shook your dad's hand once, but personality types could not be more different, right? I mean, like Judge Bork, you could ask him a multivariate, complex question with all these contingencies, and then he would just respond, no. And that was it, and your dad would be like the kind of person you would say, well, you would get into it was just very different types, but anyway.
I mean, Bork he was such an important figure in the rise of the American legal movement, and because of what happened to him when he was nominated, I think a lot of people don't recognize that, and they just kind of see him as the guy who didn't get through the hearings. But the court as it is now, I think it's fair to say we probably wouldn't have it as it is now if it weren't for Judge Bork. I think that's also true of my father, but I and I know you weren't asking me about Judge Bork, but I do think it's just kind of tragic how he was treated, because he gets all of his contributions are kind of overshadowed by that.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears now. On the panel that we did, you lamented the decline of private investigator TV shows.
Yes.
And you started listing a few, and then I threw out Banachek.
Yeah, and I felt terrible. I hadn't heard of it.
So Banachek was a George Peppard TV show from, like, I want to say 71, 72, 71, 73, something like that.
So between Breakfast at Tiffany's and the A-Team, this is what he did.
Well, and also I would, like before the A-Team, there was, of course, Damnation Alley, which terrified me as a kid. But
I don't know that show either.
That was a movie where my understanding, I think I got this from Pod, but my understanding is, so Damnation Alley was a post-apocalyptic movie where basically Peppard, and I really hope I haven't screwed this up if it wasn't Peppard in it, but I'm pretty sure it was. But anyway, they had these super RVs that could withstand a nuclear war, and they had to go do something to fix something or whatever, and there were like man-eating cockroaches, and it kind of terrified me. But the funny thing is, it came out, I believe, in 77, and Hollywood was convinced it was going to be the giant blockbuster, and instead this little movie that they all had scorn for called Star Wars blew it away. But anyway, Banachek was a Polish PI who solved major crimes and then got a cut, like 10% off the top, from the insurance company. And his big go-to thing was he constantly talked about these old Polish proverbs. And I'll just read you a couple of them. A truly wise man never plays leapfrog with a unicorn. Read the whole library, my son, but the cheese will still smell after 4 days. 12 good horses and silver candlesticks won't stop the snow from falling in Bialystok. Anyway, it's all
true. All undeniable. Yeah.
When an owl comes to a mouse picnic, it's not there for the sack races. And anyway, there's a lot of that stuff. And I just figured I would.
So were those aphorisms kind of the show's way of kind of telling Polish jokes? Are those aphorisms supposed to be like the Polish submarine with screen doors, or what?
I don't think so. I mean, again, it came out when I was a toddler, and I only saw it intermittently in reruns. But there's just something about the name Banachek that I just always loved. It's sort of like it rolls off the tongue the way Barnaky does from Bill Murray in Stripes. Yeah, Barnaky, he owes me money.
My sister married somebody by the last name Banashevsky, which is maybe even better. And which one of the reasons I'm surprised I've never heard of this show. You think they would have claimed that name for their own, but oh well.
All right, so make your case about what the lamentable decline of PI movies.
Well, to name some other shows that your listeners may have heard of. Well, I mean, you go back to there's Sherlock Holmes, obviously, but and film noir often was about private investigators, especially Philip Marlowe from the Raymond Chandler novels. But in the 70s and 80s, so many TV shows were based on them, like one of my dad's favorite, The Rockford Files. I'm rewatching that series now, and it's fantastic. Obviously, it's not HBO prestige quality, but it's really good. Magnum PI, obviously the PI is private investigator. Simon and Simon, which was a favorite that people have forgotten about, but that was a really good one. And there are others. Those what's that?
Heart to Heart.
Heart to Heart. They were PIs, weren't they? The A-Team, they were kind of PIs. I count them. And then even more recently, Burn Notice, one of Adam White's favorite shows, I think. He was a PI. Monk was sort of a PI.
Oh, for sure
he was technically a consultant, but those shows, they don't have shows like that anymore. And instead, you have a lot of crime shows just about the cops. And that in and itself isn't new. Obviously, you could name a lot like NYPD Blue or Hill Street Blues.
Or Dragnet. I mean,
exactly. But now that's all there is. And they have them for, every city in America. So, you have FBI Omaha. And it's, in other words, it's the institutionalization of, I guess, crime fighting or detective work. And I think it's just interesting, especially in a time when we actually see more skeptical of police in general. We don't have more shows that kind of have crime fighting or crime solving outside of those institutions. And I thought it was especially interesting in relation to the work of the scholar we were discussing, Paul Cantor, who really liked writing about kind of the American commercial spirit and what he spontaneous order. And the PI seems to fit in that category a bit, because he's kind of straddling the line between this public service and the institution of the police department and private commerce and capitalism. Rockford's a great example because he's always going to his police buddy friend for help, but is also always in trouble with the police. And every other episode has to spend the night in a cell for one reason or another.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and we were going to get to your, our bone of contention, in a minute, but about Perry Mason, but it's funny because I think it's a good point, right? Certainly in the context of Paul Cantor's stuff about the sort of the gray area of sort of informal justice, which is just a huge, huge part of American culture. And I think one of the things that we didn't talk about too much on the panel, but I think Paul Cantor was kind of right that basically the Western is American culture, right? And even gangster movies in a way are kind of Westerns. And and then there's this, and Walking Dead, right? And there's this weird fine line that, or subtle distinction between, it's sort of like there's the private investigator for hire who basically ends up, turning the kid over to the cops, right? Which is sort of like what the guys in Scooby-Doo do, right? And they just sort of, they catch the guy, those meddling kids catch the guy and then hand him over to the cops. But then there's also sort of justice for hire, which is a little darker, right? And that's sort of have gun will travel, but also the Equalizer, where it's like the law can't help. And so if you need justice, you go to the Equalizer. I like the Denzel Washington Equalizer movies. I have not watched the Queen Latifah remake of it. Um, and but I think it's sort of it's not quite the same, right? I mean, there's one thing about like, you catch the guy, you hand him over to the cops, and there's another thing where the A Team was sort of more of a. I mean, I guess they didn't kill a lot of people at the end, did they? There were a lot of bullets.
No.
Yeah, a lot of
and
dying in that show.
a lot of car accidents where people jumped out right on time. It was basically like G.I. Joe. Nobody from Cobra ever actually died. They escaped right on time. It was similar with the A Team. You were talking about Justice for Hire. The ultimate example of that is Death Wish, right? And you're right; those are much darker. I don't remember the Equalizer. I haven't seen the movies or the Queen Latifah, but the television show I remember as well. He was British, wasn't he? So obviously he was going to be dapper and smooth. But it was much less gritty than Death Wish, and he was clearly the good guy. But am I right in remembering that Death Wish, you kind of rooted for him, but also he wasn't clearly the good guy? Or it's been a very long time since I've seen.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I've rewatched it fairly in the last year or two. You kind of he was sort of an anti-hero, you kind of rooted for him and all this, but part of the point of the thing was the indictment of the system, where
right, exactly. Yeah.
At the end of the movie, the police catch him and say, "Get out of town," because Bronson's character is too popular to prosecute. And which is an interesting indictment of the system,
I was talking to somebody about the private investigators after our panel, and they mentioned Batman. And Batman was originally, the series was Detective Comics, and you wouldn't hire Batman, but he was essentially a private investigator who worked closely with the police. Whenever Commissioner Gordon needed them.
I think it was actually for a while. The tagline was "World's Greatest Detective" or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Yeah. And I think if you charted the course of Batman throughout the comic books and popular culture, he starts as a freelancer who helps the cops as things get grittier, to basically justice, on his own kind of thing.
But I guess what I find so interesting, to circle back on why this topic interests me for, probably to an unhealthy extreme. It's very weird that these shows aren't popular anymore, given the decline in appreciation for the blue that we seem to have. I mean, Blue Bloods is such a popular show. You talk to anybody over 50 or 60. That is always like one of their favorite shows. It's become, it's the Matlock of our time. And that's kind of strange given the tenor of our times and the attitudes, the decline, I guess, in respect or faith in police work.
Yeah, I think part of, it's not quite a vulgar Marxist explanation for it, but I think part of it, I would suppose, actually has to do with market segmentation, right? So like most of those shows you're talking about, the FBI shows, and by the way, I should say one of my oldest and dearest friends is a showrunner for the FBI shows, or was, but the FBI shows, Blue Bloods, at least when it was originally running, the NCIS shows, right? They're all CBS shows. And CBS, it's weird, like, because I'm under the age of 60, with the exception of maybe Big Bang Theory or one or two other shows, like, I haven't watched any CBS shows in like 20 years. And their cultural footprint, it's weird. They're among the highest rated, most successful shows of the last quarter century. But they're like, you could combine all of the shows, and their cultural footprint for somebody who reads the New York Times regularly is less than Girls, which never got more than like 400 or 500,000 viewers. No, it's weird.
That's true. And Big Bang Theory is another great example. I do not like that show at all. But it was and it's had no real cultural footprint in the ways that, a lot of other sitcoms have. But that was enormously popular. But it just never got any of the sort of traction or conversation that even a show like How I Met Your Mother did.
Yeah. Which I have to say, look, I actually watch Big Bang Theory quite a bit because I can fall asleep to it. Like I get these shows where like I've seen it, I get it. I don't care about rewatching it enough, but it's something it has a soporific effect for me now. And part of it is that when I see it on TV, because I now it'll like almost Pavlovian make me drowsy. All right, so we have to just get the elephant out of the room. While you were doing your list of your lament, literally tearing your cloth and gnashing your teeth about the decline of detective shows, I said, well, they've done this remake of Perry Mason, and I think it's excellent. And you just turned on me, wheeled on me, and said, I disagree. And you wrote me a note apologizing for it, which I told you was unnecessary. But now you get to make your case. Why don't you like the Perry Mason show?
I didn't see the end of season 2. So maybe it got very good. And it's not because I'm a huge fan of the original Perry Mason, because I've only really seen a few episodes. But I will acknowledge that the HBO reboot is beautiful, very well produced and well acted. But it seemed to me like they were trying too hard to subvert what the original was about, which was, from what I understand, what I've seen, the original was kind of a belief in justice, a belief in the American system. And the new version kind of subverts that at every turn. Perry Mason is he's basically an alcoholic. His life is a total mess, and he just kind of winds up in his position by accident. His DA friend doesn't really believe in justice. The last I saw, he was just saying it's basically all a game. And it's just, I just wondered why they bothered calling it Perry Mason, apart from the obvious reason, which is the IP prestige. It was just so different from the original that I found it a little annoying, and I might even call it a little too woke with some of the casting. It seemed like they were checking an awful lot of boxes with the secondary characters as well.
So I will grant you some of that. I think that the cinematography of it, the set design, the costuming is, if it doesn't get an Emmy for one or all of those things, the system is rigged. And I agree with you. There was a little too much transgressive, let's topple icon kind of stuff. I didn't get, in part because if you, like you, I didn't really like or watch the original Perry Mason show. In part because it was so friggin' predictable, because he won every single case but one in the history of the show. And so it got really formulaic for me. But I think the world setting of it is really, really impressive. I agree. Some of the casting, some of the, like sexuality, the gay characters and all of that, and the Asian secretary, and there's some identity politics box checking stuff in it. I agree. But at the same time, if you can get past the name Perry Mason, I just think it's a great show. I mean, I think it's really well done and well developed. And I don't know this, but before the original TV show, there was a Perry Mason radio show, and before that, there were a lot of novels and short stories. And for all I know, it's more authentic towards the original stories. It's sort of like, I kind of feel like this way, or it may not be, but like, you see these movies, where they try to do Cinderella in a gritty way, or, that kind of thing. And people get really pissed off about it. And then I'm always like, have you ever read like what the original stories were like? Where the Slippers, originally the stepsisters, they cut off their toes to fit into the slippers, right? You could go a lot darker. And
the stories were grim.
yeah.
No, I've actually heard that the new version is more in keeping with the original novels and stories. But yeah, I haven't read those myself either, so I can't confirm that. But yeah, that does make sense. Well, I mean, just to go back to kind of the over the top nature of how many issues they're trying to cover. In the most recent one, in the second season, you've got kind of the migrant worker issue or illegal immigration issue, and then the class issues involved, and then the black photographer / investigator who lives in Watts. They make a point of saying that this neighborhood he's living in is Watts. It's just it seemed a little bit forced a lot of the time. But I will say,
just to push back on, but look, again, I do not like politicized movies and art and all that kind of stuff. And I don't like beat you over the head didactic stuff. But, if you're going to do modern age LA noir, you kind of got to deal with the racism and messed upness. I mean, I thought LA Confidential, was a great movie, but it dealt with some of that stuff too.
Yeah. All right, that's fair. I just wish they could be more skillful with it and do it with in a more precise way. And I don't know how to do that in this one. In this case, let me give you an example. This is a neighboring complaint, and I actually wrote about this for the Dispatch. There was a masterpiece adaptation of the 18th century novel Tom Jones, and they made some pretty significant changes to it. And the most significant one was that the female love interest, a central character, is played by a black actress. And her backstory is that she was the daughter of a plantation owner and one of his slaves. And she comes back to England and has this love affair with the title character. It's a clever way to update it, but it's a little bit of a stretch to think that would happen. But the showrunners said, we read about cases like this where it does happen. So, but I'm willing to go along with that. The problem is, it's almost like they don't make a big enough deal about it. Nobody mentions the main reason Tom Jones, his relationship with this woman is frowned upon is that he's a bastard child and she is well-born. Or at least her grandfather is a squire. So it's a class issue. Nobody ever mentions the racial problems. So in a way, I'm glad they didn't make race a bigger deal because it would have so distorted the original, and just, again, make you wonder, well, why are you even calling this Tom Jones? On the other hand, if you're going to make that initial change, you kind of need to see it to its logical ends to be really credible.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. I mean, you can go like, I have no problem with like introducing African American or Asian characters into the past, and if you're going to make them, if you're just casting actors to have a more inclusive cast or the best actor or all that kind of stuff, it's fine. But if you're going to lean into the character's race or sexuality or any of that kind of stuff, you kind of need to have the other characters deal with it as they would have contemporaneously, or it just feels like they're retconning the past. And I think that's often a problem, All right. So you entered this issue into the discussion on the panel, and it seems apropos, given, first of all, the fact that there were some listeners to the podcast I did with Brett Devereaux about ancient Rome who accused me of of anti-Italian bigotry, and then there's the problem of my wife who does not like mob movies because she thinks they glorify the mafia and criminals. And you brought up in the Kinter panel that that you played the identity politics card and said, as somebody with a vowel at the end of their last name, you needed to address some question about the Godfather or whatnot. So just sort of generally speaking, as a proud Italian American, do you have issues with the Hollywood portrayal of the mafia? Which if you feel like you have to say the mafia doesn't exist, we can have that conversation too. But how do you think about that stuff?
My family, the Godfather is Thanksgiving viewing for us. So, I was not raised to see that as an insult to Italian Americans. In the context of the panel, a student attending commented afterwards that she didn't like the Godfather movies because they glorified the mob. And that's not how I see the movies at all. They dress well. It's a beautiful film. They dress well, they eat well, they party well. But things do not end well. And I think I think the movies show that what the characters end up sacrificing to get what they have, and have only fleetingly isn't worth what they do. So, from that perspective, I don't see them as glorifying that way of life. And from the perspective of kind of Italian American heritage, I guess I'm not offended by it at all, in part because nobody else in my family was, but also because I think by the time I was watching it, there really wasn't a whole lot of anti-Italian American bigotry. I mean, my father was the first Italian American on the Supreme Court, and that was a big deal at the time. But it wasn't a huge deal at the time. And I think by then, Italian Americans by the time I was experiencing these films, Italian Americans had been assimilated enough into the culture that it wasn't so offensive.
Yeah, it's funny. It surprises a lot of people to point it out, but like the ethnic politics thing of it, identity politics seems like too strong, but was sufficiently powerful in the 80s that Mario Cuomo lobbied for Scalia to get the seat, for your dad to get the seat on these grounds, that like it was good for the Italians. And like it is inconceivable that a leading light of the Democratic Party today would make that kind of argument for a very conservative nominee. Oh, it's good for the polls, just it would not, the Czechs need this, it wouldn't occur to people. And it shows you, I think it's kind of progress, but it's also kind of just, interesting.
Yeah. Frank Sinatra wrote my dad a congratulatory letter after he was confirmed, which was surreal, but also kind of awesome.
Yeah, that is awesome. I was just watching a few minutes of Ocean's 13 the other night, and while we were getting dinner ready, and there's this whole spiel in that that you never betray, you never go back, you never break faith with somebody who shook Sinatra's hand. And it's just like the number of skeevy people who probably shook Sinatra's hand. This idea that like, oh, he was the noblest man on earth is just kind of weird, even among thieves.
Yeah. Well, Jonah, taking it back to your original question, I mean, it reminds me of you remember that conversation. I don't remember what season it was in The Sopranos, but Tony's therapist is having dinner with an Italian American friend, and this friend just goes off about how much he hates. I think mob movies because it's so disparaging to the image of Italian Americans. That always struck me as a little bit. That scene struck me as a little bit anachronistic. Only because, but that would have been in the early 2000s. I just don't think there was. I don't think there were many people who were thinking that way then about Goodfellas or, for that matter, The Sopranos.
Yeah, her ex-husband was constantly going on about. He was part of the Italian American Anti-Defamation Society or something like that, right? And I always read that as the writers and producers of the show venting against people who are giving them crap in real life. But other than that, I don't know. Yeah. So, Adam Kuiper had asked this question on the panel about, why are so many movies and TV shows set outside the law, right? Westerns, mob movies, all this gray area, private detective things. And it's one of those kind of questions that on the one hand, I thought was, I don't mean this as an insult to Adam, but it was sort of like simultaneously dumb and really smart because, on the one hand, you can't make a lot of good entertaining movies where everybody plays by the rules. They do their homework. They don't cheat on their wives. They come home straight after work and have dinner, go to bed, and start their day over and live lives of decency because there's just no drama in that, right? So you have to go outside. And the reason I bring this up, and that was part of my answer to him, is just like, that's where the entertainment is. But I think, there's a reason why in so many of the sci-fi movies, they have to go to the fringes of space like in Aliens or whatever, because while I would love to watch a movie set on Earth that's just about sort of normal futuristic politics, and in business, most people wouldn't. And
well, look at when Star Wars became about taxes in the prequels,
right.
It was
right. Although
not quite as exciting.
The new I can't remember what it's called. The gosh, it's going to kill me. The spin-off series that they recently had. Andor. I think
that was good.
Really well done about how they kind of show the dark side of being part of an evil empire, as it were. But I think that's sort of the reason I bring it up is I think that's sort of the defense of mob movies to a certain extent is you have to show the world outside of conventional morality and rule of law and basic decency, in part to sort of get more at human nature, right? Because people who work hard and play by the rules and all that kind of stuff, you don't display the sort of interesting eternal parts of human nature in ways that are particularly entertaining. You got to sort of put people in extreme situations. And, whether that's an asteroid coming or aliens attacking or, you're a mob movie, that's where the sort of the eternal truths of human nature are going to emerge and be kind of more interesting.
I think that's right. And Cantor wrote really well about The Godfather as a kind of I don't know, maybe a moral telling of the American dream is too strong a statement, but an exploration of the American dream. And it could have just as easily, you can tell stories about the American dream with just legal small businesses, but The Godfather is a version of the American dream working outside of the law that says a lot of things about the American dream, the everyday American dream, and the experience of immigrants, and how they assimilate over the course of generations, or how they try to stay connected to their ancestry over the course of those same generations. So another way of putting it is, if I can don my pretentious former English professor cap, Emily Dickinson's line, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant." The slant in these cases is looking at human nature from really, sometimes not even through humans, but through very skewed or unlikely perspectives. And from those perspectives, saying something that I don't want to say speaks to all of us, but demonstrates truths about ways of life within the law. And I think so. It's a combination of the excitement of the very foreign, but that doesn't work if it doesn't somehow connect to everyday truths.
So if you had to answer the question, and I've never asked this question before, but like, you kind of touched on the panel, and I remember somebody else saying something that I disagreed with, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but how would you explain the tragedy of Michael Corleone?
Okay. I talked a little bit on the panel about how Paul Cantor would have understood it. And I'm not sure my interpretation is too different from that. The tragedy is that his father wanted him to be away from the mob and to be legitimate. Maybe that's that's an overstatement. To be a politician. And so within the American framework of legitimacy. And the tragedy is that Michael didn't do that because he was drawn to his duty to his father to protect his father. And then the tragedy continues when he, whereas in the first one, he tries to protect it. He does it for his family. In the second one, he essentially betrays his family in any number of ways. Fredo being the most obvious example. And then Cantor he never discussed the third Godfather for obvious reasons, but I do think it continues the tragedy because Michael, it's again so much about the tragedy is about the family because, there's the famous line, when I thought I was out, they pull me back in, and his daughter is the victim. I'm guessing people in the theaters may have actually cheered that death, given the quality of the acting. But I think it's a tragedy of being torn between competing senses of obligation and consistently. I don't know if he chose incorrectly to protect his father, but the tragedies are ultimately tragedies about his family.
Yeah, so I mean, the reason I'm thinking about this is I think that's general. I think that's right, and it's definitely a correct. It's one correct interpretation, right? The thing I'm getting at is Cantor argued that, or said in an interview or something he wrote, that Coppola thought that it was the Godfather was really a metaphor for the dehumanizing aspects of capitalism,
right?
And one of the things I like about Cantor is he says that the creators of these artworks are often wrong about what their artworks mean, which I kind of like. But in a sense, I think there's some truth to it in this sense, and it's not the sense that Coppola meant, but there are these two spheres of life, and there's one is the sort of the close, the familiar, the tribal, the familial, the informal. As I often put it, like if my uncle comes to town and says, I don't have a hotel room, my car was stolen, whatever, can I sleep on your couch? I'm like, absolutely, right? No questions asked, right? Total stranger comes and says that to me, I'm like, no, right? And that's because the rules, the rules in the family are different than the rules in the extended order. Like we are communists in our home. It's truly each to according to their ability, to each according to their need. We don't charge our kids for food, all that kind of stuff. And in the extended order of the rule of law, that's liberal. One of the great things about what liberalism is the way to deal with strangers, right? And anyway, so it seems to me that part of where the Coppola thing about Godfather makes some sense to me is that when Don Corleone is running it, when the Pops is running it, Um, it's all organic. It's bound up in the tradition of the family. It's bound up in these rules of sort of pre-modern rules, right? That's what the opening speech is all, or opening dialogue is all about. And it flows naturally based upon shared assumptions about family, about reciprocity, about patronage and all that kind of stuff. And which is the great hypocrisy and irony and dishonesty, really, of when people like Corleone say it's just business. Because it's not just business, it's something else, right? And then Michael comes along and he sort of wants to make the mob quote unquote legitimate and modern and actually make it a business. And I always say, like, you can't run a family like a business, and you can't run the government like a family, right? You can't, if you try to take the rules of the family, impose it on the extended order, you're going to make it an autocracy. If you try to take the rules of politics or the market and apply them to the family, you're going to destroy what the family is about. And it seems to me that part of what Coppola gets at there is, if you're going to try and actually just make the mob like a business, you are going to trample all of this weird sort of sinew of shared norms about family and honor and that kind of thing. And then it just becomes evil in its own right.
And it becomes not just no longer about family, but you're willing to sacrifice your family, which is even worse. Yeah, and along the way, I mean, there's the move to selling drugs, which is kind of the first step away from kind of the honor, the Sicilian honor, and towards becoming a more American business enterprise, albeit still an illegal one. And yeah, Michael tries to make it legitimate by moving out to Vegas, but even then, I mean, there's so much illegitimacy to it. Setting senators up to take the fall for the death of hookers, for example. But yeah, I really like how Cantor talks about the movies. Well, let me take this back to your point about how he's willing to challenge the creators. This came up in the context in the panel in the context of Breaking Bad, where he was willing to challenge the writer and creator Vince Gilligan's understanding of Walter White as somebody who went from Mr. Chip to Scarface. And Paul said, I had lunch with him. He's a wonderful guy, but he was wrong about this. And I don't know what I think about whether Gilligan was actually wrong about that, but his Cantor's readings of Breaking Bad, I think, are phenomenal because and they do something that his work on The Godfather did as well, which was to take this pop culture seriously. I think The Godfather had been taken seriously for a long time already, so it wasn't so much of a leap. But with Breaking Bad, it was just a really thoughtful explication of connecting Breaking Bad to the Shakespearean tragic tradition. And along the way, Cantor keeps saying, I know this sounds ridiculous. Just be patient. I'm going to make my case. And it ends up really, I think, being a convincing case for how Walter White was a truly tragic figure, because he descended into this kind of not quite complete evil, but obviously criminal, murderous, with a hint of redemption at the end. And part of that redemption was that he recognized how corrupt he had become, and that how he had been deluding himself along the way when he said it had all been all about family. And I'm not sure that's in the case any of your listeners haven't watched Breaking Bad. At the beginning, he's in it to support his family, healthcare costs and all things like that. By the end, he acknowledges it had just been about power all along. And I wonder if does anything like that happen in The Godfather, where Michael kind of acknowledges that his reasons for getting into the family business at the beginning weren't really all that altruistic or family bound as he had convinced himself. And had he been corrupt all along? I don't know. Just a question that occurred to me comparing the two.
I think the similarity between Godfather and Breaking Bad, at least along the lines I was talking about, is that it's the arrogance of intellect for both of them. They kind of think, like they have big Chesterton's fence problems, right? Where they think that they can just grok out through their superior intellect and their superior understanding of things that they don't really understand. A better way of doing things, and I think it's much more explicit in Breaking Bad, right, where he makes the problem of taking his scientific knowledge and thinking it makes him smart about everything, and reduces human beings to basically chemical inputs, right, and dehumanizes them. So we got to close out here, but so you used to teach literature and all that kind of stuff. I'm always nervous, even though I wrote a lot about Byronic heroes and tragic heroes and anti-heroes in Suicide of the West. I'm always nervous talking about this stuff because I'm never fully comfortable with that. I'm using the terms in accordance with an actual definition. There's some things there's some words I just know what they mean, and there are other things I always have to re-look up to make sure I'm not using it wrong. So in the case of a tragic hero, does the tragic hero need to, okay, so his argument is that he's not a villain, he's a tragic hero. And my view is that, like, if you know you're doing evil and you choose to do evil, you are no longer a tragic hero, you are a villain. But at the same time, it's sort of like, deathbed conversions. If you realize that you were doing evil and you try to make amends, maybe you are a tragic hero. How does it work?
I think the tragic hero is a villain of sorts, as you suggested, because he commits evil. But the reasons for committing evil, well, first of all, he has to start from a high position, either a position of nobility or just moral goodness, and is eventually brought down, as is the case of Othello, for example. And I think that's the key element of the tragic hero. The tragedy is the descent. It's not that everything the tragic hero does is with good intentions or well-meaning or anything like that. But the tragic hero had been capable of something great and is brought low either out of pride or, jealousy and things like that. And then the Byronic hero is a little bit different because the Byronic hero stands a little bit more outside of the rest of culture,
right?
And
more true to his own code than anything else.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. And so, a lot of TV anti-heroes are more like Byronic heroes, right, than they are tragic heroes.
Byronic heroes are all over the place in popular culture. What was Omar from The Wire, right?
Yeah.
He's a murderer who murders other drug dealers, but he says a man's got to have a code, right?
And they're always, Byronic heroes are always cool. Yeah, there's something very charming and seductive about the Byronic hero.
Yeah. No one's ever given enough attention, I think, to Mel Gibson's movie Payback, which is sort of plays with a lot of this stuff, right? But we'll have to return to that another time because
that sounds good.
Between our technological catastrophe and running long, I just got to go. So thank you so much for doing this, Chris Scalia.
Jonah, can I just put in a quick plug for anybody who likes pop culture, as any listener of this entire episode would be? Cantor's books, Gilligan Unbound, Pop Culture and the Dark Side of the American Dream, and The Invisible Hand in Popular Culture are all really great cultural studies from a conservative/libertarian rather than Marxist perspective, that are, I think, would be of interest to anybody who like this episode or Glock culture. They should check those out.
Yeah, so the nice thing is that anybody who stuck around this long is going to be interested in that.
Yeah, exactly.
And anybody who isn't left a while ago, so it's okay.
All right, thanks, Jonah. I appreciate it.
Thank you.